What do you do when your wife leaves you for another man and his child? Your parents demand you take her back when she returns homeless, and you discover they've been funding her affair all along, so you project the evidence at a family dinner and change the locks while they watch? My name is Owen Garrett. I am 34 years old, and I work as a fire inspector for the city, which means I spend my days walking through buildings looking for code violations, faulty wiring, blocked exits, and the small accumulations of negligence that can turn a structure into a death trap. And over the years, I have developed a mindset that treats evidence as sacred, documentation as survival, and assumptions as the enemy of truth. I have been married to Vanessa for 6 years, together for 8, and we live in a modest 3-bedroom house that I purchased 2 years before I met her, which means the title is in my name alone, a detail that seemed irrelevant when we were happy but would later become the foundation of everything that followed. Vanessa works as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, and she has always been good at managing appearances, crafting narratives, and presenting a polished version of events that makes people feel comfortable and inclined to agree with her. And I suppose that skill is part of what made her successful at work and part of what made me blind to what was happening until it was too late. I came home on a Thursday evening in late October after spending the afternoon inspecting a warehouse renovation on the east side of town, and I noticed immediately that something was wrong because the house was dark, Vanessa's car was not in the driveway, and there was no smell of dinner cooking, no sound of the television, no signs of the ordinary domestic rhythms that had shaped our evenings for the past 6 years. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, and the silence felt heavier than it should have. Not the comfortable quiet of a house waiting for its occupants to return, but the hollow emptiness of a place that has been deliberately abandoned. And I walked through the living room and into the kitchen, and that was where I found the note. A single piece of lined paper torn from a notebook, sitting on the counter beside the coffee maker, folded once, my name written on the outside in Vanessa's neat handwriting. I picked up the note and unfolded it, and I read it once quickly and then again more slowly, because the words did not make sense the first time, or rather they made sense individually but not as a coherent explanation for why my wife had left our home without telling me she was going. The note said that she was sorry, that she had been unhappy for a long time, that she had met someone named Marcus who had a young child and needed help, and that she felt called to be part of their lives, to build something new, to start over in a way that felt honest and meaningful, and she hoped I would understand, and she would be in touch soon to discuss logistics. I read the note a third time, and I noticed that it did not say she loved me, did not say she regretted hurting me, did not say she wanted to work on our marriage or try counseling or do any of the things that people typically say when they are leaving a relationship they once valued, and I realized that the note was not an apology, it was a departure announcement, written by someone who had already made peace with her decision and was simply informing me of a fait accompli. I set the note down on the counter and I walked upstairs to our bedroom, and I opened Vanessa's closet and saw that half of her clothes were gone, the hangers pushed to one side, the shelves emptied of shoes and folded sweaters, and I went into the bathroom and saw that her toiletries were missing, the toothbrush, the makeup bag, the hair dryer, all the small objects that marked her presence in the house, and I understood that this was not an impulsive decision, not a sudden emotional break, but a planned exit, something she had been preparing for days or maybe weeks while I had been inspecting buildings and writing reports and assuming that our life together was stable. I went back downstairs and I picked up the note again, and I took out my phone and I placed the note on the kitchen counter beside today's newspaper, making sure the date on the front page was visible, and I photographed them together from 2 angles, and I uploaded the photos immediately to my secure cloud storage, because I have learned from years of fire investigations that the most important evidence is the evidence you collect in the first hour, before anyone has a chance to move things, rearrange the scene, or offer alternative explanations that muddy the timeline. I opened the banking app on my phone and I checked our joint account, the one we used for household expenses, mortgage payments, groceries, utilities, and I saw that the balance was lower than I expected. And when I scrolled through the recent transactions, I found a pending transfer. $8,000 moved from the joint account to an account in Vanessa's name alone, a transfer that had been initiated 2 days ago, which meant that she had been planning this departure for at least that long, and that she had taken the precaution of securing her finances before she left, and I took a screenshot of the transaction screen and I added it to the cloud folder, and I created a new document on my phone, a simple text file labeled Evidence Ledger, and I began typing a timeline, noting the date I found the note, the date of the bank transfer, the fact that her clothes and toiletries were missing, and the name Marcus, which I did not recognize, but which I assumed was the man she had left me for. I sat down at the kitchen table and I opened Vanessa's social media profiles on my phone, scrolling back through her recent posts, looking for anything that might explain who Marcus was and how long this had been going on, and I found a post from 6 months ago, a group photo from a volunteer committee meeting, And in the background, I saw a man holding a toddler. And when I clicked on the tagged names, I found Marcus Hollis, and I opened his profile, and I saw photos of him with the same child, and photos of him at parks and playgrounds, and photos that looked like the life of a single father trying to manage work and parenting. And I realized that this was the man Vanessa had left me for. Not a boyfriend or a secret lover in the traditional sense, but someone she had met through volunteer work and decided to rescue, someone whose life she wanted to step into and reshape. And I took screenshots of his profile and the tagged photo, and I added them to the evidence folder. And I sat there in the quiet kitchen, staring at my phone, trying to understand how my wife had built an entirely separate narrative without me noticing, and how I had missed the signs that she was preparing to leave. I spent the rest of that evening sitting at the kitchen table, going through old text messages and calendar entries, looking for patterns or clues that might explain when Vanessa's dissatisfaction had turned into a plan, and I found references to volunteer committee meetings on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, stretching back almost a year, meetings that she had mentioned casually but never described in detail, and I had never questioned them because I worked late on inspection reports, and I trusted that she was doing something meaningful with her time. I made myself a sandwich that I did not really want to eat, and I turned on the television without watching it, and I realized that I was not angry yet, not in the way I had expected to be, but instead I felt a cold clarity, the same feeling I get when I walk into a fire scene and begin cataloging violations, because anger is a distraction, and what I needed was a strategy, a method for understanding what had happened and what I needed to do next, and I knew from experience that the first rule of any investigation is to document everything before the scene changes, before people start offering explanations that blur the facts. At around 10 o'clock that night, my phone rang, and when I looked at the screen, I saw that it was my father, Graham, calling, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered, because I wanted to make sure I was calm and composed. And when I said hello, my father's voice came through the line with an edge of impatience, and he asked me where Vanessa was, and I said she left, and there was a brief silence, and then he said he already knew that. Vanessa had called them earlier this evening, crying and upset, and she had told them that the marriage was over and that she needed space, and my father wanted to know what I had done to make her leave. I felt a spike of irritation at the assumption that I was the one at fault, but I kept my voice neutral, and I said that I had not done anything, that I had come home and found a note saying she had left to be with another man, and my father said that did not sound like Vanessa, and I said it was exactly like Vanessa because she had written the note herself and taken half her belongings and transferred $8,000 out of our joint account. And my father went quiet for a moment, and then he said that relationships were complicated and that I needed to go get her and bring her home and work things out like an adult. I asked my father if Vanessa had told him why she left, and he said she was confused and overwhelmed and that she had made a mistake, and that it was my job as her husband to support her and help her get through this difficult time. And I said that she had left me for a man named Marcus who had a toddler, and that she had written in the note that she felt called to be part of their lives, and my father said that was her business, and that marriage was a commitment, and that I needed to honor that commitment by being patient and forgiving, and I realized that my father had already decided that I was the problem, that Vanessa was the victim, and that his role was to pressure me into compliance, and I felt the first edge of anger creeping in. Not at Vanessa, but at my parents, because they were making this about loyalty and family reputation, rather than about the fact that my wife had abandoned our marriage for another man. My mother, Diane, got on the line, and her voice was softer, more pleading, and she said that she understood I was hurt, but that I needed to think about the bigger picture, about family, about what people would say if I let this marriage fall apart. And I asked her if she thought it was reasonable for me to take back a wife who had left me for another man and drained our bank account, and my mother was silent for a moment, and then she said that money could be worked out, that the important thing was keeping the family together. And I asked her if Vanessa had mentioned the $8,000 when she called them, and my mother did not answer. And I realized that Vanessa had told my parents a version of the story that made her look sympathetic and made me look cold and unreasonable, and that my parents had accepted her version without asking me for my side, and I said that I was going to file separation papers, and my mother started crying, and my father took the phone back and said I was being selfish and cruel, and then he hung up. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the call log, and I realized that this was not going to be a simple divorce, that my parents were going to side with Vanessa and pressure me to reconcile, and that I needed to be prepared for a long campaign of guilt and manipulation. And I opened the voice recording app on my phone, and I tested it to make sure it was working, and then I called my father back. And when he answered, I let the recording run, and I asked him calmly if he and my mother were planning to house Vanessa, and he said that was not the point, that she was my wife and my responsibility, and I asked him if he thought it was reasonable for me to reconcile with someone who had committed adultery and stolen money, and he said I was exaggerating, that Vanessa had not stolen anything, that it was a joint account, and she had every right to take money from it, and I said that the timing suggested she had planned the departure and secured her finances before telling me. And my father said I was being paranoid and vindictive, and I asked him one more time if he would support me or if he was going to side with Vanessa, and he said he was siding with the marriage, with the idea of family, and that I needed to grow up and do the right thing, and I thanked him for clarifying his position, and I ended the call. I saved the recording to my cloud storage, and I added a new entry to the evidence ledger, noting the date and time of the call, my father's demand that I reconcile, his refusal to acknowledge the adultery or the bank transfer, and my mother's silence when I asked about the money, and I realized that my parents had already chosen their narrative, and that nothing I said was going to change their minds unless I presented them with evidence that was impossible to ignore, and I decided that I would not try to argue with them or explain myself. I would simply document everything, build a case that was airtight, and when the time came, I would present the facts and let them draw their own conclusions, and if they chose to side with Vanessa even after seeing the evidence, then I would know that the problem was not my behavior, but their willingness to ignore the truth in order to preserve an image of family unity that had never really existed. I went upstairs, and I packed a bag with clothes and toiletries, and I decided that I would stay in the house because it was mine, because I had bought it before I met Vanessa, and because leaving would send a signal that I was the one who had abandoned the marriage, and I was not going to let that narrative take hold, and I went into the guest bedroom, and I made up the bed, and I set my alarm for 6 in the morning. And I lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle. And I thought about the fact that my wife had been planning this for weeks, that she had been meeting Marcus and spending time with his child, and that she had looked at me across the dinner table night after night and said nothing, and I realized that the marriage I thought I had been living in was not the marriage Vanessa had been living in, and that the gap between those two realities was too wide to bridge. And I closed my eyes and I waited for sleep to come, and I felt a strange sense of calm, because I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew that I was not going to let anyone, not my wife, not my parents, not anyone, rewrite what had happened or pressure me into accepting a version of events that was built on lies. The next morning, I woke up at 6 and I went for a run through the neighborhood, not because I felt like exercising, but because I needed to establish a routine that would keep me grounded and prevent me from spending all day obsessing over what Vanessa had done. And when I returned to the house, I showered and made coffee and drove to the fire station where I had a full schedule of inspections lined up for the day. I told my supervisor that I was dealing with a personal matter, but that I would be able to complete my work assignments, and he nodded without asking for details. And I spent the day walking through commercial kitchens and storage facilities, checking sprinkler systems and exit routes, filling out forms with the same methodical attention I always brought to the job, and the work felt grounding. A reminder that there were still problems I could solve and systems I could understand, even if my personal life had become chaotic and unpredictable. When I got home that evening, I checked my phone and saw that I had 3 missed calls from my mother and 2 text messages from my father, all of them asking me to call them back, to be reasonable, to think about what I was doing, and I ignored them, and I opened the security app on my phone, the one connected to the doorbell camera I had installed 6 months ago after a series of package thefts in the neighborhood, and I saw that there was a motion alert from earlier in the afternoon, and when I opened the video clip, I saw Vanessa standing on the front porch, and the timestamp said 2:14 in the afternoon, and I watched as she reached for the door handle and tested it. And then she rang the doorbell and waited, looking directly into the camera, and after 2 minutes she turned and walked back to her car and drove away. I saved the video clip to my cloud storage, and I checked the activity log, and I saw that there were 2 more alerts, one at 4:47 and another at 6:33, and I opened each clip and watched Vanessa return to the house. And in the second clip, she took out her key and tried to put it in the lock, and I saw the confusion on her face when the key did not fit, when she realized that the locks had been changed, and she stood there for a moment jiggling the handle, and then she knocked softly and looked around as though she was worried someone might see her, and in the third clip she knocked harder and pulled out her phone and made a call, and I checked my call log and saw that she had tried to reach me at 6:34, and I had not answered because I had been driving home from an inspection, and I had seen her name on the screen and decided to let it go to voicemail. I played the voicemail on speaker, and Vanessa's voice came through sounding strained and uncertain, and she said that she had been by the house and that we needed to talk, that she knew things had ended badly but that she wanted to explain, and that she had made a mistake, and she hoped we could sit down and figure things out like adults. And I listened to the message twice, analyzing the tone, the word choices, the pauses, and I realized that she was not apologizing for having an affair or for draining the bank account. She was apologizing for the way she had communicated her decision, for leaving a note instead of talking to me in person, and I understood that she still believed she had the moral high ground, that she had left for noble reasons, to help a struggling single father and his child, and that if I was upset, it was because I was not enlightened enough to understand her motivations. I saved the voicemail to the cloud, and I added a new entry to the evidence ledger, noting the 3 doorbell camera clips, the timestamps, Vanessa's attempt to use her key, and the fact that she had called asking to talk but had not mentioned Marcus or the affair or the money, and I realized that she was testing the waters, trying to figure out whether I was going to be angry or accommodating, whether I was going to make this easy for her or difficult, and I decided that I was not going to respond to her voicemail, that I was going to let her wonder, let her stew in the uncertainty. Because the longer she went without hearing from me, the more anxious she would become, and anxious people made mistakes. They said things they did not mean to say. They revealed details they had intended to keep hidden. I made myself dinner, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and I opened the shared cloud photo album that Vanessa and I had been using for years to store vacation photos and holiday pictures, and I started scrolling back through the timeline, looking for anything that might give me insight into when the affair had started, and at first I did not see anything unusual, just the normal accumulation of images from our life together, dinners with friends, trips to the coast, family gatherings. But then I reached March of this year, and I saw a photo I did not remember, a picture of Vanessa and a man I recognized from the social media search as Marcus, standing in a park with a toddler on a swing set, and the photo had been uploaded by Vanessa's phone, and when I clicked on it to check the metadata, I saw that it had been taken on March 14th, which was 8 months ago, long before she had left, and I realized that the affair had been going on far longer than I had assumed. I scrolled further, and I found more photos, a picture of Vanessa and Marcus at a coffee shop, a picture of them at a street festival, a picture taken inside what looked like a living room with toys scattered on the floor, and all of the photos had been auto-uploaded from Vanessa's phone to the shared album, which meant she had not deliberately hidden them. She had simply assumed I would never look, that I was too busy or too trusting to scroll through old photos and notice that she was spending time with another man, and I felt a strange sense of validation, because this was not paranoia or suspicion. This was documented proof that the affair had been ongoing for months, and I took screenshots of each photo, making sure the metadata was visible, the date and time and location tags, and I added them to the evidence folder. I opened the shared calendar that Vanessa and I used to coordinate schedules, and I exported the last year as a PDF. And I opened it, and I used the search function to look for the word volunteer, and I found dozens of entries, every Tuesday and Thursday evening for the past 10 months labeled Volunteer Committee Meeting. And I cross-referenced those dates with the timestamps on the photos, and I saw that the park photo had been taken on a Thursday, the coffee shop photo on a Tuesday, the street festival photo on a Thursday, and I realized that the volunteer committee meetings had been a cover story, a way for Vanessa to meet Marcus regularly without arousing suspicion, and I highlighted each matching date on the calendar PDF, creating a visual timeline that showed the overlap between her stated schedule and the photographic evidence of her affair. I saved the annotated PDF to the cloud, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, and I thought about how easy it had been for Vanessa to lie, how she had kissed me goodbye on those Tuesday and Thursday evenings, how she had come home at 9 or 10 o'clock and told me about the committee's fundraising projects and volunteer initiatives, and how I had believed her because I had no reason not to, because trust is supposed to be the foundation of a marriage, and I realized that I had been living in a marriage where I was the only one honoring that foundation, and that Vanessa had been living in a different reality entirely, one where she was free to pursue whatever made her feel fulfilled or needed or important, and where I was just a stable background figure, someone who paid the mortgage and maintained the house and did not ask too many questions. I closed the laptop and I sat in the quiet kitchen, and I decided that the next morning I would call an attorney, that I would file separation papers, that I would document the adultery and the financial misconduct and the evidence timeline, and that I would do it quickly before Vanessa had a chance to file first and control the narrative, and I felt a sense of momentum building, not anger exactly, but a cold determination, the same feeling I get when I am writing up a code violation and I know that the building owner is going to argue and deflect and try to minimize the problem, but I have the documentation, I have the photos, I have the measurements, and there is no argument that can stand up against facts that are properly recorded and presented. I spent Friday morning at the fire station completing paperwork from the previous day's inspections, and during my lunch break I called a family law attorney whose name I had found through an online search, a woman named Patricia Vance who had good reviews and whose office was located downtown in a building I had inspected 2 years ago, and when I spoke to her receptionist, I explained that I needed to file for separation and that I had evidence of adultery and financial misconduct, and the receptionist scheduled an appointment for Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and I thanked her and ended the call. And I felt a small sense of relief that I was taking concrete steps rather than just sitting in the house replaying the last 6 years in my mind and wondering what I had missed. That afternoon, I drove to a commercial property on the west side of town to inspect a restaurant that was applying for a capacity increase, and I walked through the kitchen checking fire suppression systems and exit pathways, and the owner followed me around asking questions and trying to make small talk, and I answered politely but without engaging because my mind was elsewhere. And when I finished the inspection, I sat in my truck in the parking lot and I checked my phone, and I saw that I had a text message from Vanessa, and the message said that she had tried to stop by the house again and that the locks were changed. And she asked why I would do that without telling her, and she said she needed to pick up some things she had left behind. And I read the message twice, and I did not reply, because I knew that responding would open a conversation I was not ready to have. And I wanted her to feel the uncertainty, the lack of control, the same feeling I had felt when I came home and found the note on the kitchen counter. I drove home and I parked in the driveway, and I walked through the house, taking inventory of what Vanessa had left behind. Not because I cared about the objects themselves, but because I wanted to document what she had taken and what she had abandoned. And I found that she had left behind most of the wedding photos, the framed pictures that had been hanging in the hallway and sitting on the shelves in the living room, and I took them down one by one, and I stacked them in a cardboard box, and I labeled the box with a marker, and I carried it down to the basement and set it on a shelf. And I felt no sadness, just a practical sense that these were objects that no longer served a purpose and needed to be stored out of sight. I went back upstairs and I opened my laptop and I logged into the shared cloud photo album again, and I scrolled through the photos more carefully this time, looking not just for images of Vanessa and Marcus, but for any other details that might be useful. And I found a photo from April, a picture of a volunteer event at a community center, and in the background I saw a poster with the name and date of the event, and I cross-referenced that date with the shared calendar, and I saw that Vanessa had marked that evening as a committee meeting, and I realized that the event had been real, that she had actually attended, but that she had used it as a cover for spending time with Marcus, and I took a screenshot of the photo and the calendar entry. And I added them to the evidence folder, and I made a note that the affair was not entirely fabricated, that she had woven it into legitimate activities, which made it harder to detect, but also meant that there were more opportunities for documentation. I found another photo from May, this one taken at what looked like a backyard barbecue, and Vanessa was standing next to Marcus, holding the toddler, and they were both smiling. And the composition of the photo looked domestic, almost familial, as though they were posing as a couple, and I felt a brief flash of anger, not at the affair itself, but at the casualness of it, the ease with which Vanessa had stepped into another man's life and pretended to be part of his family while still coming home to me every night, and I took a screenshot and I added it to the folder, and I made a note about the date and the domestic framing of the image. I opened a new document on my laptop and I started building a detailed timeline, listing every photo by date, every calendar entry that corresponded to a volunteer meeting, every bank transaction that seemed unusual or timed to coincide with the affair, and I worked on the timeline for 2 hours, adding notes and cross-references, making sure every claim was backed up by a piece of evidence, a timestamp, a metadata tag, something that could not be disputed or reinterpreted. And when I finished, I saved the document and I printed a copy, and I put the printed pages in a folder along with printouts of the key photos and the annotated calendar PDF. And I felt a sense of satisfaction, the same feeling I get when I complete an inspection report and I know that every violation is documented, every measurement is accurate, every conclusion is supported by the code. That evening I received another call from my father, and this time I answered, and he started talking immediately without waiting for me to say hello, and he said that Vanessa had called them again, that she was staying with a friend, and that she was struggling, and that I needed to stop being stubborn and let her come home. And I asked my father if Vanessa had told him why she left, and he said she told them that the marriage had been difficult for a long time, that she had tried to make it work, but that I had been distant and unsupportive, and I asked him if she had mentioned Marcus, and there was a pause. And my father said yes. She had mentioned that she had been helping a single father with his child, and that it was volunteer work, nothing romantic. And I asked my father if he believed that, and he said it did not matter what he believed. What mattered was that Vanessa was my wife, and I had made a commitment to her. I felt the anger rising again, and I kept my voice calm, and I said that Vanessa had left me a note saying she was going to be with Marcus, that she had been having an affair for at least 8 months, and that she had transferred $8,000 out of our joint account before she left, and I said I had photos, bank records, calendar entries, all of it documented and time-stamped, and my father was silent for a moment, and then he said that I was exaggerating, that Vanessa would not do something like that, and I said I would send him the evidence if he wanted to see it, and he said he did not need to see it, that he trusted Vanessa, and I realized that my father had made up his mind, that no amount of evidence was going to change his opinion, because he had decided that preserving the appearance of family unity was more important than acknowledging the truth. I asked my father one more time if he was going to support me or if he was going to continue pressuring me to reconcile with someone who had committed adultery, and he said he was supporting the marriage, not me or Vanessa individually, and I said that the marriage was over and that I was filing separation papers on Monday, and my father said I was making a huge mistake, and I said the mistake had already been made, and it was not mine, and I ended the call, and I sat there staring at my phone, and I realized that I was not just losing my wife, I was losing my parents as well, because they had chosen to side with her narrative rather than confront the reality of what she had done. And I felt a deep tiredness, not sadness exactly, but a weariness at the thought of how much work it was going to take to rebuild my life when the people who were supposed to support me had already decided I was the problem. On Monday morning, I woke up early and I dressed in a suit and tie, not because the attorney had required formal attire, but because I wanted to approach this meeting with the same professionalism I brought to my work. And I drove downtown to Patricia Vance's office, a renovated building with high ceilings and large windows that let in the morning light, and I checked in with the receptionist, and I sat in the waiting area reviewing the evidence folder I had brought with me, making sure every document was in order, every photo was labeled, every timeline entry was clear and supported by documentation. Patricia Vance came out to greet me at exactly 9 o'clock, and she was a woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and a direct manner, and she led me back to her office and gestured for me to sit, and she asked me to start from the beginning and tell her what had happened. And I walked her through the timeline, starting with the note I had found on the kitchen counter, the bank transfer, the doorbell camera footage, the cloud photo album, the shared calendar entries, and the calls from my parents demanding that I reconcile. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, and when I finished, she asked to see the evidence folder, and I handed it to her, and she spent 15 minutes reviewing the printouts, the photos, the annotated calendar, the bank transaction logs. And when she looked up, she said that I had done an exceptional job documenting everything, that most clients came in with vague complaints and no proof, but that I had built a case that was clear, organized, and difficult to dispute. She asked me if I owned the house, and I said yes. I had purchased it 2 years before I met Vanessa, and the title was in my name alone, and Patricia nodded and said that was good, that it meant Vanessa would have a hard time claiming any ownership interest, although she might argue that she had contributed to the household during the marriage and deserved some kind of compensation, and I said that I was not interested in punishing Vanessa financially, I just wanted a clean separation with no ongoing obligations. And Patricia said that was reasonable, and that given the evidence of adultery and the fact that Vanessa had abandoned the marriage, we were in a strong position to file for separation on favorable terms. Patricia asked me if I thought Vanessa would contest the filing, and I said I did not know, that she had sent me text messages asking to talk and to pick up her things, but that I had not responded, and Patricia said that was smart, that engaging in conversations before the legal process was underway could create opportunities for misunderstandings and conflicting narratives, and that it was better to communicate through attorneys once the separation was filed. She asked me if I had any concerns about my parents, and I told her about their calls, their insistence that I reconcile, their refusal to believe that Vanessa had been having an affair, and Patricia said that parental pressure was common in divorce cases, especially in families with traditional values, but that ultimately the decision was mine, and that I should not let guilt or family loyalty prevent me from protecting my interests and my future. Patricia pulled out a separation petition template on her computer, and she began filling it in, asking me questions about the length of the marriage, the date of separation, the grounds for dissolution, and I answered each question clearly and precisely. And she typed quickly, and when she finished, she printed the petition, and she walked me through each section, explaining the legal language, the claims we were making, the relief we were requesting, and she pointed to the section where we listed the evidence of adultery and abandonment, and she said that including this level of documentation in the initial filing was unusual but strategic, because it sent a message that we were prepared, that we had proof, and that we were not going to be intimidated or manipulated into a settlement that did not reflect the facts. I signed the petition, and Patricia said she would file it electronically with the court that afternoon, and that Vanessa would be served with the papers within 5 days, and that once she was served, she would have 30 days to respond. And Patricia said that most people either responded immediately with anger and counterclaims, or they delayed as long as possible, hoping the other party would lose momentum, but that in either case we were prepared, and that I should not be surprised if Vanessa or my parents tried to contact me once the papers were served, and that I should refer all communication to Patricia's office and not engage directly. Patricia also drafted a civil no-contact order, a document that could be filed if Vanessa or anyone acting on her behalf engaged in harassment or trespassing, and she said we would hold it in reserve for now, but that it was ready to go if needed, and I thanked her for the thoroughness, and she said that family law was often messy and emotional, but that clients who approached it with discipline and documentation usually came out ahead, and I said that was exactly how I intended to approach it. I left Patricia's office and I walked back to my truck, and I sat in the driver's seat for a moment looking at the city traffic, and I felt a sense of clarity, a sense that I had taken the first major step toward closing this chapter, and that everything from this point forward would be a matter of following the process, responding to developments, and maintaining the same methodical approach that had gotten me this far. I drove to the fire station, and I spent the afternoon reviewing inspection reports and responding to emails, and I kept my phone on silent. And when I checked it at the end of the day, I saw that I had 2 missed calls from my mother and 1 text message from Vanessa asking when we could talk, and I did not respond to either, and I drove home and I made dinner and I sat at the kitchen table eating in silence. And I thought about how strange it was that less than a week ago I had been living in a marriage that I thought was stable, and now I was living alone in a house that felt larger and quieter than it ever had before. That evening I received an email from Patricia confirming that the separation petition had been filed and that the court clerk had issued a case number, and she attached a copy of the filing receipt, and I saved it to the cloud storage and I added a new entry to the evidence ledger, noting the date and time of the filing, the case number, and the fact that Vanessa would be served within 5 days. I opened the timeline document and I updated it with the filing information, and I printed a fresh copy and I put it in the evidence folder, and I realized that I was treating this separation the same way I treated a complex fire investigation, building the case piece by piece, making sure every link in the chain was documented and verified. And I knew that this approach might seem cold or calculated to someone on the outside, but it was the only way I knew how to navigate a situation where emotions could easily overwhelm judgment, and where the truth needed to be preserved against people who were willing to rewrite it in order to avoid discomfort or accountability. I went to bed that night feeling more settled than I had in days, not because the situation was resolved, but because I had a plan, I had taken action, and I was no longer simply reacting to what Vanessa or my parents were doing, and I knew that in the days ahead there would be more pressure, more demands, more attempts to make me feel guilty or unreasonable. But I also knew that I had the evidence, I had the documentation, and I had the legal process on my side, and that as long as I stayed disciplined and did not let emotion dictate my decisions, I would come through this with my integrity intact and my future secure. On Thursday afternoon, 4 days after I had filed the separation petition, I was driving back to the fire station after completing an inspection at a small manufacturing facility when I received a notification from the doorbell camera, and I glanced at my phone at a red light and saw that there was a car parked in my driveway. And when I opened the app and looked at the live feed, I recognized my parents' sedan, and I could see my father Graham standing on the front porch with his arms crossed. And I felt my chest tighten because I knew that this was not going to be a casual visit, that they had come with a purpose, and that purpose was to pressure me into changing my mind about the separation. I decided not to rush home, and I finished my drive to the station at a normal pace, and I spent 20 minutes filing paperwork and responding to emails, and then I drove home, and when I turned onto my street, I saw that my parents' car was still in the driveway. And as I pulled up, I could see that there were other people in the car. And when I got closer, I realized that Vanessa was sitting in the back seat, and there was a small child in a car seat next to her, a toddler with dark hair who was holding a stuffed animal, and I understood immediately what was happening, that my parents had brought Vanessa to my house, that they had orchestrated this ambush, and that they expected me to open the door and let them in and have some kind of reconciliation conversation. I parked on the street rather than pulling into the driveway, and I got out of my truck and I walked toward the house. And my father stepped off the porch and came toward me, and he said we needed to talk. And I said I had nothing to talk about. And he said that Vanessa had been staying with them for the past few days, and that she was struggling, and that the child needed stability. And I said that was not my problem, and my father's face flushed with anger. And he said I was being cruel and selfish, and that I had a responsibility to my wife, and I corrected him and said that Vanessa was not my wife anymore, that I had filed separation papers, and that she would be served with them any day now if she had not been already. My mother Diane got out of the car and walked over to where we were standing, and she looked tired and worried, and she said that she understood I was hurt, but that Vanessa had made a mistake, and that everyone deserves a second chance. And I asked my mother if Vanessa had told them the full story, if she had told them about Marcus, about the affair, about the $8,000 she had transferred out of our joint account. And my mother looked uncomfortable, and she said that Vanessa had explained that she had been helping a single father and that things had gotten complicated. And I said that was a nice way of describing adultery. And my mother flinched at the word, and she said that I did not need to be crude, and I said I was not being crude, I was being accurate. I asked my father where Vanessa had been staying before she came to their house, and he hesitated, and I asked him again, and he said she had been staying with Marcus for a couple of weeks. And I asked him what happened, why she was not staying with Marcus anymore, and my father said it did not work out. And I asked him to be more specific, and my mother interjected and said that Marcus had asked Vanessa to leave, that his housing situation had changed, and I said housing situation had changed, and my father snapped at my mother and told her to be quiet. And I realized that my father did not want me to know the full story, that he was trying to control the narrative, and I said, "It sounds like Marcus evicted her," and my mother nodded slightly, and my father glared at her, and I understood then that Vanessa had not left Marcus by choice, that she had been kicked out, and that she had turned to my parents because she had nowhere else to go. I looked past my parents to the car, and I could see Vanessa watching us through the window, and she looked pale and anxious, and the toddler was squirming in the car seat, and I felt no sympathy, only a cold clarity, because this confirmed what I had suspected, that Vanessa had not left me because she was in love with Marcus or because she felt called to help him. She had left because she wanted something different, something that felt more exciting or meaningful, and when that had not worked out, she had expected to come back to the stability and security that I represented, and I was not going to let that happen. I told my father that I had filed separation papers, that the marriage was over, and that Vanessa needed to find somewhere else to live, and my father said that she had nowhere to go, and I said that was not my responsibility, and he said, "What about the child?" And I said the child was not mine, the child was Marcus's, and that I had no obligation to house another man's child or the woman who had abandoned me to play house with that man. My father stepped closer to me and he said I was going to regret this, that I was tearing the family apart, and I said no. Vanessa tore the family apart when she had an affair, and my parents were tearing it apart by siding with her instead of acknowledging what she had done, and my father said we were trying to keep the family together, and I said you are trying to avoid embarrassment. You are trying to pretend that this did not happen, so you do not have to explain to your friends at church why your daughter-in-law left your son for another man. My mother started crying, and she said that I was being heartless, and I said I was being realistic, and I asked her if she and my father had given Vanessa money, and my mother looked away, and I said I will take that as a yes, and I asked how much. And my father said that was none of my business, and I said it was absolutely my business if my parents were funding my wife's affair, and my mother said they had given her $3,000, and that Vanessa had told them it was for marriage counseling, and I said, "Did you ever see a receipt for marriage counseling? Did you ever ask her for proof?" And my mother was silent, and I realized that my parents had not asked questions because they had not wanted to know the answers, because knowing the truth would have required them to take a side. And they had chosen to believe Vanessa's story because it was easier than confronting their own son's pain. I told my parents that they needed to leave my property, that I had asked them politely, and now I was telling them directly, and my father said, "We are not leaving until you agree to talk to Vanessa." And I pulled out my phone and I said, "If you do not leave in the next 60 seconds, I am going to call the police and report you for trespassing," and my father said you would not do that. And I started dialing, and my mother grabbed my father's arm and said, "Graham, we need to go." And my father stared at me for a long moment, and then he turned and walked back to the car, and my mother followed him. And they got in the car, and my father started the engine, and I watched as they backed out of the driveway, and Vanessa was still in the back seat, and she was looking at me through the window, and I could see that she was crying, but I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just a calm certainty that I had made the right decision, and that I was not going to let anyone guilt me into undoing it. I stood in the driveway, and I watched the car drive away, and I saw a neighbor standing on her porch across the street, and she had clearly been watching the whole thing. And I wondered how much she had heard, how much she had understood, and I realized that this was going to become neighborhood gossip, that people were going to have opinions about what had happened, but I did not care, because the only opinions that mattered were the ones that were backed up by facts. And I had the facts, I had the documentation, and I had the evidence that would prove that I was not the villain in this story. I went inside, and I locked the door behind me, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened my phone, and I took a screenshot of the doorbell camera footage showing my parents' car in the driveway and Vanessa in the back seat, and I saved it to the cloud storage with a timestamp, and I opened the evidence ledger, and I added a new entry, noting the date and time, the fact that my parents had brought Vanessa to the house, the fact that my father had admitted she was staying with them, the fact that my mother had revealed they had given Vanessa $3,000, and the detail that Vanessa had been evicted by Marcus, not that she had left him by choice. And I realized that this was the first major crack in Vanessa's narrative, the first piece of evidence that she had not been honest with my parents. And I knew that this information would be useful later when I needed to show that Vanessa had been manipulating everyone, not just me. The following morning, I received a text message from my sister Claire, and it was the first time I had heard from her since Vanessa had left. And the message said that our parents had called her the night before and asked her to talk to me, to convince me to reconcile with Vanessa, and Claire said she had refused, and that she wanted to meet with me in person because there were things I needed to know. And I texted back immediately and asked if she was free that afternoon, and she said yes, and we agreed to meet at her house at 2 o'clock. Claire lived in a small bungalow on the east side of town with her husband Daniel, and when I arrived, she was waiting on the front porch, and she hugged me tightly, and she said she was sorry for everything I was going through, and I said I appreciated that. And she led me inside, and we sat at her kitchen table, and Daniel brought us coffee, and then excused himself to give us privacy. And Claire looked at me with a serious expression, and she said that our parents had been calling her every day for the past week, and that they were upset and angry, and that they blamed me for refusing to reconcile. And I said I knew that already, and Claire said there was more. Claire told me that our parents had asked her to come to a family meeting at their house to discuss the situation, and that she had agreed to go because she wanted to understand what was happening, and when she arrived, she found Vanessa sitting in the living room with our parents. And our father had said that they needed to present a united front, that the family needed to support Vanessa during this difficult time, and Claire said she had asked Vanessa directly why she had left me, and Vanessa had said that the marriage had been difficult for a long time, that I had been emotionally unavailable, and that she had found support and companionship with Marcus, and Claire said she had asked Vanessa if she was having an affair, and Vanessa had said it was complicated, that she and Marcus had developed feelings for each other, but that it had started as a friendship, as volunteer work, and that things had evolved in a way she had not expected. I asked Claire what our parents had said when Vanessa admitted to the affair, and Claire said that our father had immediately tried to reframe it, saying that Vanessa had made a mistake, but that she was willing to work on the marriage, and that I was being stubborn and unforgiving, and Claire said she had pushed back, she had said that I had a right to be upset, that adultery was not a small mistake, and that Vanessa had left me, not the other way around, and our father had said that I had driven Vanessa away by being distant and cold, and Claire said she had asked him for examples, for specific instances of when I had been distant or cold, and our father had not been able to provide any, and our mother had just sat there looking uncomfortable, and Claire said she had realized I was going to host the confrontation I was planning, and I realized that I needed to do it soon, before my parents had time to solidify their narrative, before they had time to convince more people that I was the problem, and I decided that I would invite them and Vanessa and Claire to my house for dinner, that I would prepare a presentation, that I would lay out all the evidence in a clear and undeniable way, and that I would force them to confront the truth, and I would do it in my home, on my terms, with my evidence, and I would not let anyone leave until they had seen everything, and I would not argue or justify or defend. I would simply present the facts and let the facts speak for themselves, and if my parents still chose to side with Vanessa after seeing the evidence, then I would know that the problem was not my behavior, it was their willingness to ignore reality in order to protect their own comfort, and I would be able to walk away from them with a clear conscience, knowing that I had given them every opportunity to see the truth and they had chosen blindness instead. I spent the weekend preparing for the dinner that I had decided would be the final confrontation, the moment when I would stop reacting to my parents' pressure and Vanessa's manipulations and instead take control of the narrative by presenting the evidence in a way that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. And I worked methodically, organizing the photos, the bank statements, the doorbell camera footage, the cloud album screenshots, and Claire's written statement into a slideshow that followed a clear chronological order, starting with the goodbye note and ending with my parents bringing Vanessa to my house with Marcus's child in the back seat. I kept the slides simple, no commentary, no emotional language, just dates and timestamps and images, because I knew that the more I tried to explain or justify, the more opportunity I would give my parents to argue or deflect, and I wanted the evidence to speak for itself, to create a record that was so clear and so thoroughly documented that there would be no room for alternative interpretations. On Sunday evening, I sent text messages to my parents, to Vanessa, and to Claire, inviting them to dinner at my house on Tuesday at 6 o'clock. And I said that this would be a final conversation, that we would discuss the separation and the future, and that I expected everyone to attend, and my parents responded quickly, saying they would be there, and Vanessa responded an hour later, asking if this meant I was willing to work things out, and I did not reply to her question. I simply confirmed the time and the address, and Claire responded saying she would come, and asking if I needed her to bring anything, and I said no, just bring yourself. And she sent back a thumbs-up emoji, and I felt a small sense of solidarity knowing that she would be there, that I would have at least one person in the room who was committed to the truth rather than to a comfortable fiction. On Monday, I went to work, and I completed my inspections with the same focused attention I always brought to the job, and I did not tell anyone at the fire station what I was planning because I did not want advice or opinions or well-meaning attempts to talk me out of it. And when I got home that evening, I set up the dining room, moving the table so that it faced the television on the wall, and I connected my laptop to the TV using an HDMI cable, and I tested the slideshow to make sure every image was visible and every timestamp was legible, and I printed small cards with QR codes that linked to a cloud folder containing all of the evidence, and I placed one card under each dinner plate face down so that my guests would not see them until they sat down and I told them to look. On Tuesday, I left work early and I stopped at a grocery store and I bought ingredients for a simple meal, pasta and salad and bread. Nothing elaborate, because this was not a social dinner. This was a presentation, and the food was just a formality. A way to get everyone to sit down and stay in one place long enough for me to show them what I had found. I cooked the meal, and I set the table with 5 place settings, and I put a glass of water at each seat, and I dimmed the light slightly so that the television screen would be easier to see, and I checked the slideshow one more time, and then I sat down on the couch, and I waited, and I felt a strange calm, the same feeling I get right before I deliver a critical inspection report to a building owner who is not going to like what I have to say, a calm that comes from knowing that I have done the work, that I have the documentation, and that the outcome is now a matter of letting the process unfold. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and I opened the door, and my parents walked in, and my father was carrying a casserole dish covered in foil, as though this were a normal family dinner, and my mother kissed me on the cheek and said she was glad I had invited them, that she had been praying we could work this out. And I nodded without saying anything, and I took the casserole and set it on the kitchen counter, and a few minutes later Vanessa arrived, and she looked nervous, and she was wearing a dress and makeup, and I realized that she had dressed up for this, that she thought this was going to be a reconciliation, that she thought I had invited her here to forgive her and take her back. And I felt no guilt about the fact that she was wrong, because she had built her expectations on lies and wishful thinking rather than on anything I had actually said. Claire arrived last, and she hugged me and whispered, "Are you ready?" And I said yes. And she squeezed my hand, and I invited everyone to sit down, and my father took the head of the table, which irritated me because it was my house and my table, but I let it go because it did not matter, because in a few minutes none of the social niceties were going to matter, and my mother sat next to my father, and Vanessa sat across from them, and Claire sat next to me, and I served the food, and we ate in relative silence, with my mother making small talk about the weather and asking Claire about her job, and my father saying nothing, just watching me with a guarded expression, as though he was waiting for me to say something that would confirm his suspicions that I had not really changed my mind. And when everyone had finished eating, I stood up and I cleared the plates, and I said I wanted to show them something, and my father said, "We are here to talk, not to watch a presentation," and I said, "This is part of the conversation," and I picked up the remote, and I turned on the television, and the first slide appeared, a photograph of the goodbye note that Vanessa had left on the kitchen counter, and I heard Vanessa inhale sharply, and my mother looked confused, and my father leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, and I did not say anything. I just advanced to the next slide, which showed the bank transaction, the $8,000 transfer, and the date, which was 2 days before Vanessa had left, and I heard my mother whisper, "Oh no," and I advanced to the next slide, which was a screenshot from the doorbell camera, showing Vanessa testing the door handle and the timestamp in the corner of the frame, and I advanced again, showing the 3 attempts she had made to get into the house. And my father said, "This is an invasion of privacy." And I said, "It is my doorbell, my house, my property," and I kept advancing. The next series of slides showed the cloud photo album, the pictures of Vanessa and Marcus at the park, at the coffee shop, at the street festival, and with each slide I showed the metadata, the date the photo was taken, which was 8 months ago, 6 months ago, 5 months ago, all of them during the time when Vanessa had told me she was at volunteer committee meetings, and I showed the shared calendar entries. The Tuesday and Thursday nights marked as committee meetings, and I highlighted the dates that matched the photo timestamps, and Vanessa said those were innocent, we were just friends, and I did not respond. I just kept advancing, and my mother was crying quietly, and my father's face was red, and Claire sat silent, watching. I advanced to a slide that showed Claire's written statement, the description of the restaurant meeting, the envelope, the date, and I said, "This is a witness statement from Claire, describing a meeting where Dad gave Vanessa cash 5 months ago," and my father said, "That was for marriage counseling," and I said, "There was no marriage counseling," and I advanced to the next slide, which showed a blank screen with a single line of text that said, "Vanessa told Mom and Dad she needed $3,000 for marriage counseling, but there are no counseling receipts, no therapist appointments, no insurance claims, nothing." And my mother looked at Vanessa and said, "Is that true?" And Vanessa looked down at her plate and did not answer. I advanced to the next slide, which was a screenshot of a text message Vanessa had sent me asking if this dinner meant I was willing to work things out. And I said Vanessa believed this was a reconciliation dinner, and I advanced to the next slide, which was a photograph I had taken from the doorbell camera on the day my parents had brought her to my house, showing Vanessa in the back seat of their car with Marcus's toddler. And I said, "Vanessa did not leave Marcus by choice. Marcus evicted her, and she came to you because she had nowhere else to go." And my father said that is not relevant, and I said it is absolutely relevant, because it shows that Vanessa's story about being called to help a struggling single father was a lie. She left me for him, and when he did not want her anymore, she tried to come back. I advanced to the final slide, which showed a QR code, and I said, "This code links to a cloud folder that contains every piece of evidence I just showed you, plus additional documents, bank statements, calendar entries, and witness statements." And I said the cards under your plates have the same QR code printed on them, and you can scan them with your phones and review the evidence at your own pace. And my father said, "I do not need to see any more." And I said, "That is fine. But the evidence exists, it is documented, it is time-stamped, and it is not going to change." And I turned off the television and I sat down. The room was silent for a long moment, and then my mother said, "Vanessa, did you lie to us?" And Vanessa said it was not like that. It was complicated. And my mother said, "Did you take our money and use it for the affair?" And Vanessa did not answer, and my mother started crying harder, and my father said, "This is not helping anyone." And I said, "It is helping me, because now you know the truth, now you have seen the evidence, and you cannot say that I am overreacting or being cruel or tearing the family apart, because the family was already torn apart. Vanessa tore it apart when she had the affair, and you tore it apart when you gave her money and sided with her without asking me what happened." Claire spoke for the first time, and she said, "Mom, Dad, Owen has been telling you the truth this whole time, and you did not want to hear it, and you asked me to pressure him to reconcile, and I refused because I saw the evidence, and I know what Vanessa did, and I am not going to participate in pretending it did not happen." And my father looked at Claire and said, "You are choosing him over family." And Claire said, "I am choosing truth over lies, and there is a difference." Vanessa stood up and said she was sorry, that she had made mistakes, that she knew she had hurt me, but that she wanted to try again, and I said no, and she said please. And I reached into my pocket and I pulled out a folded document, and I slid it across the table, and I said, "This is a civil no-contact order. It was drafted by my attorney, and it will be filed tomorrow morning, and it prohibits you from contacting me directly or through third parties, and it prohibits you from coming to my house or my workplace, and if you violate it, there will be legal consequences." And Vanessa picked up the document and read it, and her hands were shaking, and she said, "You are really doing this." And I said, "Yes, I am really doing this." My father stood up abruptly, and his chair scraped against the floor, and he said that I was making a huge mistake, that I was throwing away my marriage and destroying the family over pride and stubbornness, and I said I was not destroying anything. I was simply refusing to pretend that Vanessa's affair had not happened, and that if the family could not survive without lies and denial, then maybe it was not worth preserving. And my father's face turned a deeper shade of red, and he said I had always been cold, that I had always put rules and procedures ahead of people, and that Vanessa had told them I was emotionally unavailable. And I asked him when Vanessa had told them that, and he said she had been telling them for months, since the spring, and I realized that Vanessa had been building a narrative with my parents long before she left, that she had been laying the groundwork for her departure by painting me as distant and unfeeling, so that when she finally left, they would already be primed to see me as the problem. I asked my father if Vanessa had told them she was unhappy in the marriage, and he said yes, she had mentioned it several times, and I asked him why he had never said anything to me, why he had never asked me if there were problems or if I needed help, and my father was silent for a moment, and then he said that Vanessa had asked them not to say anything, that she said she was trying to work it out on her own, and I said, "So you knew my marriage was in trouble. And instead of talking to me, your son, you gave my wife money and kept her secrets, and my mother said we thought we were helping, and I said you were helping her have an affair, you were funding her betrayal, and my mother put her face in her hands and sobbed, and I felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just a hollow tiredness, because I realized that my parents had been complicit, not out of malice, but out of a willingness to believe the person who told them the story they wanted to hear, and they had chosen Vanessa's version of events because it allowed them to feel like they were supporting someone in need, and it was easier to see me as cold and unfeeling than to acknowledge that their daughter-in-law was a liar and a cheat. Vanessa stood up and said she needed to leave, and I said that was fine, and she walked toward the door, and my mother said, "Vanessa, wait." And Vanessa turned around, and my mother said, "Where are you going to go?" And Vanessa said she did not know, maybe a hotel. And my mother looked at my father, and my father said Vanessa could stay with them for a few more days. And I said that was their choice, but that if they continued to house her and support her, then they were making it clear whose side they were on. And my father said, "We are not taking sides." And I said, "Yes, you are. You have been taking sides since the day she left, and you have been taking her side." And my father said, "We are trying to keep this family together." And I said the family is already broken, and you broke it when you chose to believe her lies instead of asking me for the truth. Vanessa left, and the door closed behind her. And my father said he and my mother were leaving as well, and I said that was fine, and my mother stood up, and she walked over to me, and she put her hand on my arm, And she said she loved me, and that she was sorry I was hurting, and I said, if you loved me, you would have asked me what happened before you gave her money. You would have listened to me before you decided I was the problem. And my mother's face crumpled, and she said, we did not know, and I said, you did not want to know, and there is a difference. And my father took my mother's arm and led her to the door, and before he left, he turned and looked at me, and he said I was going to regret this, that I was going to end up alone, and I said I would rather be alone than surrounded by people who lie to me and expect me to accept it. And my father shook his head and walked out, and the door closed, and the house was silent, except for the sound of Claire breathing next to me. Claire stood up and she hugged me, and she said I was proud of you, and I said I did not feel proud, I just felt tired. And she said that was normal, that standing up for the truth was exhausting, especially when the people who were supposed to support you refused to see it. And I said I knew that Mom and Dad were not going to change their minds, but I had needed them to see the evidence, I had needed them to know that I was not overreacting, that I had documentation, that everything I had said was true, and Claire said you gave them every opportunity, and they chose to ignore it, and that is on them, not on you. And I nodded, and I felt a tightness in my chest. Not sadness exactly, but a sense of finality, as though a door had closed and I was standing on the other side of it, looking back at a version of my life that no longer existed. Claire helped me clean up the dishes, and we worked in silence, and when we finished, she said she needed to get home, and I walked her to the door, and she said that if I needed anything, if I needed to talk or just needed company, I should call her, and I said I would, and she hugged me again, and she left, and I locked the door behind her, and I walked through the house turning off lights, and I went upstairs to the guest bedroom where I had been sleeping, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about the fact that in the space of 2 hours I had effectively ended my relationship with my parents, had made it clear to Vanessa that there would be no reconciliation, and had drawn a line that could not be uncrossed, and I felt no regret, because the alternative would have been to accept a version of reality that was built on lies, and I was not willing to do that. Not for my parents, not for Vanessa, not for anyone. I opened my phone, and I checked my email, and I saw a message from Patricia Vance, my attorney, confirming that Vanessa had been served with the separation papers 3 days ago, and that she had 30 days to respond. And Patricia said that based on the evidence I had provided, she expected that Vanessa would either not respond at all, or would respond with a request for mediation, and that either way we were in a strong position, and I replied thanking her for the update, and I said that I had given Vanessa a copy of the drafted no-contact order at dinner, and that I wanted to file it officially tomorrow morning. And Patricia replied within minutes saying she would file it first thing, and that once it was filed, Vanessa would be legally prohibited from contacting me, and that any violation would be documented and could result in legal consequences. I put my phone on the nightstand, and I lay down on the bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the slideshow, about the way my parents had looked when they saw the evidence, about my mother crying, about my father's anger, and I wondered if they would go home and look at the QR code, if they would scan it with their phones and review the evidence folder, or if they would delete the cards and pretend the dinner had never happened, and I realized that it did not matter, because I had done what I needed to do, I had presented the facts, I had given them a chance to see the truth, and if they chose to ignore it, then that was their decision, and I could live with that, because I had acted with integrity, I had documented everything, and I had refused to participate in a collective delusion. I thought about Vanessa, about the way she had looked when I slid the no-contact order across the table, and I wondered where she was now, whether she was at a hotel or whether my parents had taken her back to their house. And I realized that I did not care, that her problems were no longer my problems, and that the sooner I stopped thinking about her, the sooner I could start rebuilding my life. I thought about my father's parting words, his prediction that I would end up alone, and I realized that he had meant it as a threat, as a warning, but that I did not see it that way. Because being alone was not the same as being abandoned. Being alone was a choice, a deliberate decision to step away from relationships that were toxic or dishonest, and I would rather be alone and clear-headed than surrounded by people who expected me to ignore reality in order to make them comfortable. I closed my eyes and I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the dinner, the slides, the silence, the tears, and I realized that I was waiting for something, some sign that my parents would call or text, that they would apologize or at least acknowledge what they had seen. But my phone stayed silent, and after an hour I got up and I went downstairs and I poured myself a glass of water, and I stood in the kitchen looking at the dining room table, and I saw the QR code cards still sitting under the plates where my parents had left them, and I realized they had not taken them, they had not scanned them, they had simply walked out, and that told me everything I needed to know about their willingness to confront the truth. I picked up the cards and I put them in the evidence folder, and I took a photo of the dining room setup, the television, the empty plates, the untouched cards, and I added the photo to the cloud storage with a timestamp and a note that said, Evidence presented to parents and Vanessa on November 14th. All parties present, QR codes provided, parents declined to review additional documentation, and I closed the folder and I went back upstairs, and this time, when I lay down, I felt calmer, because I had completed the task I had set for myself, and whatever happened next was out of my control, and I could accept that, because I had done everything I could to give my family a chance to see the truth. And if they had chosen blindness instead, that was their burden to carry, not mine. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter, not happy exactly, but unburdened, as though I had been carrying something heavy for weeks and had finally been allowed to set it down, and I got dressed and I drove to the fire station, and I spent the day completing inspections and writing reports, and when my colleagues asked how I was doing, I said I was fine, and I meant it, because for the first time since I had found Vanessa's note, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just reacting, and I knew that there would be more steps to take, more paperwork to file, more boundaries to enforce, but I also knew that the hardest part was over, and that everything from this point forward would be a matter of execution, of following through on the decisions I had already made, and I was good at execution, I was good at following through, and I was not going to let guilt or sentiment or family pressure divert me from the path I had chosen. The following morning, I called Patricia Vance's office, and I confirmed that the no-contact order had been filed, and her assistant sent me a copy of the stamped filing receipt, and I saved it to my cloud storage, and I added a final entry to the evidence ledger, noting the date and time and the case number, and I realized that this was the last piece of documentation I needed, that the case was now complete, that I had built a record that was thorough and airtight, and that whatever happened next would be a matter of legal process rather than personal confrontation. I went to work, and I spent the morning inspecting a hotel renovation downtown, checking sprinkler coverage and emergency lighting, and when I finished, I sat in my truck in the parking garage and I checked my phone, and I saw that I had received a text message from an unknown number, and when I opened it I saw that it was from Vanessa, sent from a phone I did not recognize, and the message said that she was staying at a budget motel on the edge of town, that she had no money and nowhere to go, and that she needed help, and I took a screenshot of the message, and I forwarded it to Patricia with a note that said this was a violation of the no-contact order, and Patricia replied within minutes saying she would file an incident report, and that I should not respond to Vanessa under any circumstances. And I blocked the unknown number, and I deleted the message thread. And I felt no guilt, because Vanessa's situation was a consequence of her own choices, and I was not responsible for rescuing her from the outcomes she had created. That afternoon I drove to a hardware store, and I purchased new locks for the front door and the back door, even though I had already changed them once, because I wanted to make sure that no one, not Vanessa, not my parents, not anyone from my old life, had any way to access my house. And I spent the evening installing the locks, working slowly and carefully. And when I finished, I tested each one multiple times, and I put the old locks in a box in the garage, and I labeled the box with the date, and I realized that I was treating even this small task as though it were part of an official record, as though every action I took needed to be documented and preserved, and I understood that this was how I was going to move forward with the same methodical attention to detail that had gotten me through the separation, and I was okay with that, because discipline and documentation were the tools that had kept me sane, and I was not going to abandon them now. I made myself dinner, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked around the house, and I realized that it felt different now, quieter but also more solid, as though by removing the people who had been lying to me, I had created space for something more honest, and I did not know yet what that something would be, whether it would be new relationships or simply a deeper relationship with myself, but I knew that whatever came next would be built on a foundation of truth rather than on the shifting ground of other people's narratives. I opened my laptop, and I closed the evidence folder for the last time, and I moved it to an archive directory, and I created a new folder labeled Forward, and I left it empty because I did not yet know what would go in it. But I liked the idea of having a place to put the things that came next, the projects and plans and possibilities that would define the next chapter of my life. I went upstairs, and I lay down in the guest bedroom, and I thought about the fact that I had lost my wife, my parents, and the version of my family that I had grown up believing in. But I had kept my integrity, my house, my job, and my ability to see clearly, and I realized that those were the things that mattered most, because relationships could end and families could fracture. But the way you conducted yourself, the way you documented the truth and refused to accept lies even when accepting them would have been easier, that was something that no one could take from you. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, not happiness, not yet, but a quiet certainty that I had done the right thing, that I had acted with honor, and that I could live with the consequences of my choices, and I closed my eyes, and I let myself drift toward sleep. And for the first time in weeks, I did not dream about Vanessa or my parents or the note on the kitchen counter. I simply slept, deeply and without interruption. And when I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through the window. And I lay there for a moment listening to the silence. And I realized that the silence was not empty, it was clean. It was the sound of a life that had been stripped down to its essentials. And I got up, and I went downstairs, and I made coffee, and I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the street, and I saw a neighbor walking her dog. And she waved, and I waved back, and I felt connected to the world again. Not to the old world of lies and loyalty tests and manufactured family unity, but to a simpler world where people waved at each other in the morning and went about their business without demanding that you betray yourself in order to make them comfortable. And I realized that this was what closure felt like. Not a dramatic ending, not a final confrontation, but just the quiet recognition that something was finished, that the door had closed, that the locks had been changed, and that I was ready, finally, to walk forward into whatever came next.